Greetings and assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you all for taking time out of your Sunday to attend and participate in our book launch. In celebration of Women's Month, welcome to the book launch of Suitcase of Memory. We are delighted to welcome the author A'Eysha Kassiem. A'Eysha Kassiem is a South African journalist and editor whose career spans almost 2 decades. She has been a news editor at the Cape Times and News 24, as well as editor of Fin24 and Print Week in Dubai. She is a fellow of the German-based International Journalists Program and the US State Department's International Leadership Program. Joining us today as well in conversation, we have Connie Benson and Iman Omar. Dr. Connie Benson is an executive member of the Salt River Heritage Society and a lecturer at the University of Cape Town in the History Department, working in the areas of gender history, urban history, public history, and oral history. Her research is on collective interventions in histories of contested development and the mobilization, demobilization, and remobilization of struggle history in Southern Africa's past and present. At her PhD drew on 60 life narratives of women's organized resistance to forced removals and for housing from the peak of apartheid to the present. Since 2006, she has been producing life histories of self-organized and unfolding political struggles of collective resistance against displacement and for the access to land and public services such as water, housing, and education in South Africa. Iman Omar is an aspiring media professional and writer. She attended St. Mary's College of Notre Dame in the US, studying media and communication studies with a minor concentration in gender and women's studies. She has taken a keen passion for social justice and community outreach and hopes to one day merge these passions into her professional work. Those are our two panelists. I'd like to read you a short blurb from the book. Bastiaan Bredenkamp is dead, but even the dead have secrets. From the grave, Bastiaan weaves together the extraordinary tale of his life. Bastiaan, the heir to the Goedleven farm, suffers from a rare condition that allows him to remember everything that has ever happened to him since the day he was born. When Khadija III arrives at the Bredenkamp's Stellenbosch home on a Thursday in October in the time of Hendrik Verwoerd, she brings with her a world from which Bastiaan has been sheltered. But it is her daughter, Rashida, who captivates the young Bastiaan. Except to love her, he will finally have to tell his secret. He is not who he appears to be. So now I'd like to thank our audience for attending our book launch. And A'Eysha, I would like to begin with you to read a short excerpt from the book for us. Thank you, A'Eysha.
Good afternoon and assalamu alaikum to everyone, and shukran for that lovely introduction, Nadia. I'm so thrilled to be with these incredible women on this panel. So let me just start by saying thank you to Connie and shukran to Iman. So I'm going to be reading a short extract from the book, Suitcase of Memory, just to give a little bit of context to the extract. So there is something that happens in the book, which is quite significant in the second part of the book. There's a trial that unfolds. And the part that I'm about to read is just before the judgment. It's on page 248, if you happen to have the book with you. To judge a man, you must know his heart. You must strip down his skin and read the words that make up his soul. You must understand what fuels his mind and the way his blood pumps through his veins. Does his heart quicken out of fear or love? Does it beat stronger out of bravery or cowardice? You must learn the strength of his convictions and the fluidity of his beliefs, the weight of the anchor that binds him to others, and the balance of the tightrope that carries him through his days. On the morning of Judge Willems's ruling, neither Mrs. Brown nor I could make it out of Hendrik Grobler's offices. The street below was teeming with journalists and photographers who had started to camp outside the door since early that morning. Do we have a plan? I asked Mrs. Brown, who was peering out of the window. Well, from what I can tell, the only way out is out. Are you ready to take them on? I nodded. Even vultures have to eat, I said, and shrugged. The sound of the reporters bustling on the other side of the door grew louder just as I reached for the handle. Someone's coming, a voice shouted from the outside. The door is opening. Flash, flash, flash. Mr. Breedenkamp, do you believe the judge will rule against you? Someone asked. And what about Sanri Breedenkamp? Have you spoken to her since her testimony? The mention of Mama Sanri made the hair stand up on my arms. I missed her, as any son would miss his mother, and I felt my eyes sting before I could answer. As you would know, Robert, Mrs. Brown said, addressing one of the journalists with whom she was seemingly familiar, it would be inappropriate for Mr. Breedenkamp to engage with a witness on the opposing side, at least not until the trial is formally over and the judge has delivered his ruling. Mr. Breedenkamp would not want to be seen as trying to intimidate or as bargaining with state witnesses. From our end, we have respected the law. Mrs. Brown pushed me through the crowd without any warning. I stumbled my way through, with her hand still pushing against my elbow. We drove to court in silence. Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you so much, A'Eysha. That was beautiful. Thank you. We'd like to begin now with maybe Iman having a question or two posed to A'Eysha.
Yes, first of all, I want to say I enjoyed this book so much. It's like a perfect combination of just tradition and history, but it's also very funny. Like there's a lot of inside jokes that is very relatable to me and my own family. And there's a lot of layers to it as well. It has a personality of its own. So first of all, I just wanted to start off to say it's an amazing book. I'm interested, since we are on a women's panel, I am very interested to, in terms of you have very strong female characters in the book. And they, like, can you speak a little bit about how you formed the identities of these characters and what influenced you in
that's great. That's a great question, Iman. I really appreciate that. Okay, yeah, I love talking about the female characters in the book. So the first thing that I wanted to say was that I really don't like the term strong female character, okay? Because let's be clear, we would never say a book has strong male characters, okay? So that's step one. Step two is simply the fact that, I've never met a woman who isn't strong. To say woman means strong, okay? So let's just say, okay, these are strong characters, period. Okay, that's my first thing. So the crafting female characters for me was really important. And a lot of thought went into this because the first thing is I really don't like stereotypes. So that's always one of the biggest things that writers can get wrong, is where you portray women in your books as being the damsel in distress, or the lovelorn female who's waiting for a man to do something, or, and come on, okay? Women don't like to wait. We do our own stuff, okay? Just FYI for the men watching as well, okay? So the women in my book, they're never waiting. They're not waiting for anything. They take matters into their own hands and they make things happen. So that was the second part of it. The third thing about the women in the book, quite a few of them are mothers. Okay, and so women are quite often mother figures. And in this book, there are about 3 different mother figures. And they're all very different and they come from very different in backgrounds and different contexts, right? But they have one thing in common, which is basically their love for Bastiaan Bredenkamp, who is the narrator in this book. Of course, the way that they express that love is very different. But for me, I really wanted to summarize, or I really wanted to tap into the idea of motherhood. You know, because I think very often when we talk about mothers, we think of them as these carers or the nurturers or the helpers. But mothers are so much more than that. And as we read about these different mother figures in the book, we find out that they have had entire lives beyond their children, lives and memories and experiences that go beyond being a mother. You know, and motherhood, as a mother myself, is such an incredibly layered experience. And so bringing that to the story was something that was especially important to me. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, that is so true. So true, A'Eysha. Connie, would you like to just jump in?
Sure. Actually, I'm going to ask you my second question first because it kind of springboards off. I mean, I really appreciated the way that there were not stereotypes in this book, even though there was so much that was so familiar across, you know, the layers and kind of breadth and complications of Cape Town, Cape Town now and Cape Town going back to, you know, the 60s and the 70s. And I was wondering, you know, in the relationships between these women in the book, their relationships cross lines of race and then how that intersects with gender. So they at once have so much in common and then at once have, you know, these moments in the book where the limits of that really come through. And I really liked the way that you were able to have such specific personalities, but also, you know, be so clear on the limits of apartheid and the kinds of structures people were born into. So those tensions between structure and agency and to what extent people could make decisions and who had power to make decisions. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how you came to portray the race dynamics, especially in those gendered relationships between the 3 key women in the book.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Look, I have to say that, you know, a lot of writing the book was also quite difficult, especially as a woman of color, as a Black writer. You know, a lot of the scenes for me personally, it was quite emotional to write some of them, especially in terms of how these women interact. I think, you know, the hardest or the most complicated relationship was certainly between Mama Sanri, who is the madam in some ways in the story, and of course the nanny or the maid, who is Khadija 3 in the book. And so their relationship was always so complicated and so interesting to me at the same time, because I think on the one hand, they have so much in common. You know, there are so many things about them, not just as women, but as mothers, you know, and there were just so many parallels between them. And yet because of the racial construct and because of the time that they find themselves in, you know, they just simply can't seem to get over this enormous boundary of race. So as much as they connect, and I think there's a clear friendship there, there's still this barrier. And for me, that was such an important thing, because I think, you know, very often books and people obsess about romantic love, you know, as being the be all end all. But friendship for me, I think, is something that is not lesser than love. Friendship is love, right? It's on the same level in my mind. And so I wanted to really show just how apartheid broke things down beyond the things that we can see. You know, it's not just, oh, look at these different neighborhoods, or, oh, look at the different income streams. It's very much things related to the way people actually feel, something that is seemingly so simple as friendship. So there's that dynamic, and of course the power dynamic of that as well. And I think one of the hardest things as well was being inside Mama Sanwi's mind. I mean, again, as a Black writer, to write this mind of this white woman who lives in apartheid was not an easy thing to do, and I really wanted to bring some compassion and empathy to her story as well, which I hope comes across, rather than, oh, here is this, racist person. It's a lot more layered, I think, and nuanced than all of that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'd like to ask a question as well. A'Eysha, I'd like to know, who was your second favorite character in the book? Your second favorite, and why?
Well, it's interesting that you say second favorite, because I haven't said who my first favorite is.
Who's your first favorite?
And listen, being a writer and being a mother, I kind of relate to, I don't like to choose my favorites, because there are consequences when you choose your favorites, even if they're characters. So, but because you asked me, I'm going to be drawn into it. So I think it's my second favorite, you say. Okay, fine. So I think my second favorite is probably Hendrik Grobler, who is Bastian Bredekam's defense lawyer. A lot of people like to talk about Hendrik Grobler because he is such this larger-than-life personality. But I loved Hendrik Grobler because he was just like this wild card character. I didn't always plan to write him the way that I did, but I really needed somebody who wasn't afraid to say what needed to be said in such a tense environment and in such a tense time period. I needed a character who could just say what he was thinking. And, given the time, it had to be a white male, because, I mean, come on, it's apartheid, right? Who else is going to be able to say what they can say without any consequences? And so Hendrik Grobler was also quite quirky and quite funny, I thought, at times. And so I liked that about him. And I love bringing that element to a book that, a lot of people say, oh, we thought this book was going to be heavy, because it's about apartheid, because it's about our history, because it's so loaded with things. But when they read it, they say, hey, actually, as Iman said, it's really funny at times, where you can actually take a step back and find the irony and the humor in what it means to be South African.
Yes, so true. Iman, would you like to pose your second question?
Yes. So my second question is, you touched on it a little bit. But as an aspiring writer myself, I'm very interested in the process of writing, like in terms of like each character. Henry, for example, like you explained, he has a background of his own in terms of why he even took this case in the first place. And so, like, developing that narrative, what was the process, and what was like your creative style in doing that?
So, when I talk about writing, I always talk about how it is a really, really volatile relationship, okay, between the work and the writer, and sometimes it feels almost impossible. So just to kind of rewind a little bit here. So, I talk about this a lot sometimes, but, it took me 15 years to write this book. Okay. So it wasn't like I woke up and went, oh, I've got this idea, I'm just going to go and do it, and it's going to be published. It really wasn't like that at all. Okay. It was a series of failure. Okay. Because this is something that's really, really important to me, and I really want to talk about this, is that we always imagine that success is something that just kind of falls from the sky, and especially for young people to understand that success happens after failure. Okay. Failure gets this negative reputation, and we don't want to even talk about our failure, but you need failure, and I failed many, 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 many times, with this book. I wrote 7 different versions of this book. Okay. And they were all failures. So it wasn't until I reached, when I reached a certain point when I felt like, okay, so I found 7 ways that failed. Let's try this one more time. And that's, of course, how, was the final version, and the book was finally born. But that being said, it remains an incredibly difficult thing to write anything, quite honestly. and I think a lot of people assume that because you're a good writer or because you're good with words, that it's something that comes easily to you. And no, it just stays a hard thing. I'm sorry to tell you, but it's a really difficult thing. But that being said, I mean, to give advice to anyone who would love to become a writer, I mean, I always say there are two things that you absolutely have to have. The one thing is that you have to read, okay? You can't be a good writer if you don't also read. They go hand in hand, breathing in, breathing out. They go hand in hand. You have to do them together. And you need to read everything, read a lot of different things. Especially young people think they're going to have to read these big, massive books that are at the library, but read comic books, read magazines, read everything that interests you. I love comic books. Like Asterix and Obelix is my favorite comic book. I read them still, okay? And I'm 38 and I still read those. So really read as much as you can, because it all goes into your imagination. It becomes part of your toolkit, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you need to stay curious. And this kind of speaks a little bit to my journalism background as well, but you need to be curious about the world, about people, about why they do things, And I think it's something that's sorely lacking perhaps in all of us. Replace judgment with curiosity. Instead of just standing there and going like, oh, this person is like this. Be curious about that. Why do people make the decisions they do? Because that's what goes into creating layered characters. I could have written Hendrik Grobler without a backstory, and you would probably not have been able to relate to him in the same way, if he didn't have a backstory, if you didn't know a little bit about why he made the decisions he did. So stay curious, very important.
Thank you for that. So you're telling me there's still hope, because I've been failing a lot.
Of course. There's always hope. There's always hope. Okay.
So Iman, we wait in anticipation for your book.
I'm waiting.
In anticipation. Okay, Coney, would you like to go?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the conversation, because I have to do a lot of writing, but I don't consider myself a writer, and definitely not a creative writer. I do a lot of history work where you weave in stories together, but the idea of coming up with characters, making characters up, is not something I have any experience with. But the book is so historically grounded. And so, I mean, it's historically grounded, but like you say, it's not a heavy book that's rehashing everything we've already heard. At the same time, it reminds us of, it almost gets away from the stereotypes, as you say. And it shows us so many places and so many moments, but sometimes in characters' backstories, sometimes just hovering in the background, and sometimes in some of the metaphors. And three examples kind of stand out for me. There's like just this one line at one point where, this is not going to be any spoilers or anything, but where Khadija 3, so there, it's you're introducing her, and there's a line about her second husband, and how he had been a respected Mulana in Hrabo, and then he had a freak accident and died when trying to fix one of the speakers on the minaret at the Gatesville Mosque. And it's just a one line, but it's like peppered throughout the whole book are these parts of Cape Town and moments that you can, that are drawn in, but also in the way that it's metaphor. Like at one point, there's a sentence or two about love that's so powerful. You say, but love is a strange and unusual guest, like a wayward lounger. It sleeps in the heart, wakes to feed on morsels of hope, and then when fully roused, demands an audience with management. Emboldened and drunk with a fool's bravery, it lays out its requests and resists anything that threatens its early eviction. For even in the districts of the heart, forced removals are openly defied. And it's those moments where, forced removals are brought in. And there's another point where there's a parallel about waiting in line at home affairs. And I was just wondering, you know, how did you do research for this book? Did you use archives? How did you decide which bits of history to pull in? What was your sort of process with the kind of historical parts of the novel? I guess in parallel to what Iman was asking about the character development.
Yeah, thanks, Connie. So there are two parts to the answer to this question. The first is that, you know, so the title of the book is Suitcase of Memory, right? And part of that is because I think of our memories and our history as being something that we often inherit from others. We inherit it from our families, from the generations who came before. And so we carry our memories and our history like a suitcase, you know, throughout our lives. You know, it's not something we can just put down and check in, you know, it's something we all carry with us, right? So that's the first thing. And for me, certainly with my own personal suitcase of memory, a lot of this book is a tribute in some ways to my own ancestors, especially my grandparents. There are little subtleties in the book that are tributes to them. For example, there's a character in this book that is a champion pigeon racer, and my grandfather was a champion pigeon racer. I know nothing about racing pigeons, by the way, you know, but it was something that I wanted to bring in the book. It's on the cover of the book as well, as you will see over here, and also there are birds at the beginning of each chapter. So they've all long since passed, but I really wanted to pay tribute to them and homage to my grandparents and my great-grandparents even in the book itself. And then, of course, there's also my own childhood memory as well. So I'm from Cape Town. I'm from Mitchell's Plain. It's where I grew up and spent the first 30 years of my life. And I really, I'm Cape Townian in every way. So the Cape Townian aspects that you mentioned are things that are woven into the book very intentionally. You know, and so I wanted to put in some of my own history and traditions as well in the book, things that I may have heard as old wives' tales or superstitions that make being Muslim in Cape Town so incredibly unique, you know, and where Islam is practiced in a way that it isn't anywhere else in the world, you know. And so I wanted to bring some of that as well, because representation for me, I think, is probably the most important thing. And I think Cape Muslims are sorely lacking when it comes to South African literature. And yet we've been in the city for 400 years, you know. And so for me, that was something that I really wanted to infuse into the book. So that's the personal, sentimental part of me that's in the book. Then the historical part, of course, is where I had to go. I'm a journalist, so I had to go looking for information from history, but not in a way where it's from history textbooks, which I think sometimes records our history in a rather bland way, but specifically from old newspapers. And so I spent a lot of time just reading old newspapers, trying to pick up on the tidbits of everyday life, you know, like what concert was going to be playing in the city, or, you know, what were people talking about, you know, over Christmas lunch and iftar buka dinner tables, you know, to kind of infuse that into the story rather than the big events, you know. So there are some references, of course, to Sharpeville, or some inferences to the Rivonia trial, or things like that. But I really wanted to have the tiny little things that make up our everyday, because I think the most important thing that we sometimes forget, you know, is that despite the time period, right, life still goes on in its ordinary everyday ways. You know, much like we're living in this historic time now of Corona, people still get married, they still fall in love, they still have babies, you know, as it has always been, you know, since the beginning of time. People remain people, human beings remain human beings. And so there was certainly a merging between my own sentimentality with the book, and also then, you know, visiting the archives and tapping into the core history to bring the book together.
Thank you, A'Eysha. A'Eysha, you know, I would just like to raise something that I found very interesting. I found very interesting how Bastian vacillates between Christianity and Islam. So he draws on both when need be, you know. He goes to church, and he goes and prays in the church, and then when he comes home, he can come home and he can go down and make salah and cup his hands and make dua like Muslims and like we do. That was so very interesting for me, as we both, as in Cape Town, we lived through both of that. We went to school, we learned the Lord's Prayer, we came home, we said our Shahada, you know, we came to the table, we had buka. So we all had that. And then it was okay. There was nothing wrong with it. We weren't more Christian, we weren't more Muslim. We were balanced. I really enjoyed that part of, you know, the book, of how he, you know, he draws on what he needs in Islam when he needs it, Christianity when he needs that. I really did enjoy
Glad
that.
you mentioned that, Nadia. No one else has brought that up really, which I'm so glad that you mentioned. You know, because one of the core themes in the book is about the sameness in diversity. You know, it's about whenever we have conversations with each other, we almost always start from a place of difference. You know, we always look at one another and go, okay, so what's different about the other person? How are we different? What do we differ on? You know, we very seldom talk from a point of sameness. And the reality is, you know, is that, well, we have far more in common than we realize, I think. You know, and so that idea of having a character who identifies with Christianity and Islam, you know, two religions that are so often portrayed as being polar opposites, you know, was something really important to me, because they're not polar opposites at all, you know. And so there are various subtleties in the book like that as well, looking specifically at the similarities between us, you know, and what it means to be human, you know, because spoiler, you know, we are all the same. So, you know.
So true. Thank you so much. Iman, would you like to, have you anything else that you like to share with us? Anything else that you picked out of the book that of interest or questions?
Yes, so based on Auntie Nadia, what you just mentioned, that is also one of my favorite parts of the book, especially Khadija 3's, how she kind of guides Bastian into Islam, and her view of like how she when he asks, when he first meets her, are you a kafir, and she's like, there's no such thing. So that touched me right away. But I think one of the things I really loved as well is there's a slight touch on an intergenerational like conversation in the book, where the youth of the are a lot more like not rebellious, but like they are mobilizing, they're trying to be involved, and despite like their parents being like working in the system and all of this, they also I'm not explaining it right, but
I completely understand what you mean.
Yeah, it's the what touched me about that specific correlation is that it's especially in today's time, that intergenerational conversation still exists, where even now, like my parents, for example, were part of that youth of that time that were fighting against apartheid. But now we have different struggles that we're fighting, and they are like, okay, and I guess my generation is a little bit more like, okay, let's go and mobilize and do all these things. So was that kind of an accidental thing, or was that intentional in bringing up like as in part of the book?
Look, you know, I think when you sit down to write a novel, there is very little that is not intentional, you know, because you've got to make those words count for you. Yeah, you're only given so many words, and so you've got to make them count. Yeah, they've got to work for you. So everything in the book is very much intentional. Of course, I love hearing when people see their own theories, you know, where they link parts in the book which I didn't even think about, but then, you know, it just helps with the engagement, and it really opens my own mind as well, you know, because it is of course the reader's prerogative, you know, to take away what they want from a book. You know, I can tell you, oh, the book is about this and that and whatever, you know, but every reader, you know, and that's of course the beauty of reading, you know, is that it's so subjective, you know, and everybody takes away what they choose. You know, so one of the relationships in the book, which I actually really want to talk about, and I'm glad you reminded me, was basically the relationship between Rashida and Khadija III, which of course is this intergenerational thing, and of course also two women. So Rashida, for those who don't know, is Khadija III's daughter, and Khadija III is Bastiaan Berenkamp's nanny or maid, housekeeper. And they have such a fascinating relationship because, as you say, Rashida is this daughter, you know, and she is also this unbelievable revolutionary, you know, she's this woman who's just badass, you know, and she's all about, listen, this, you know, this is not okay. We don't live in an equal society, and we need to do something to fix this. And she's all about, you know, gung-ho, and we need to be at the protest, and we need to say down passes and etc. You know, and then you have her mother, Khadija, who seemingly appears to be completely opposite. Khadija is the nanny, you know, she listens to what Mama Sanri, you know, tells her to do. She, you know, goes about her every day, etc., etc. And of course, Rashida and Khadija III, they clash quite a bit because of it, you know, because Khadija, and there's this line in the book where Khadija says, oh, the reason I gave Rashida's name was because I knew it would be a good name for a maid. Right. And so Rashida, on the other hand, goes, well, why am I busy peeling potatoes for food that I'm not even going to eat? You know, like, what is that about? You know, so you have this big struggle. And for me, I really wanted to underline the idea of what struggle means, because I think struggle doesn't mean the same thing to everyone, especially in an intergenerational way. You know, for Rashida, struggle means I'm at the protest, I'm fighting for something. For Khadija, struggle means survival. It means, listen, I don't know how to change the situation I'm in, but I need to put food on the table. And so my struggle means that I need to just make this work for me, you know. And so while they're both struggling, right, they're both trying to make things work for them, Rashida and Khadija III, they are seemingly on opposite playing fields, but in fact, not at all.
Yeah. I also, just a quick comment, I also find that maybe towards the end, Rashida lost a lot of her feistiness and mellowed down with age. That kind of came across for me. Would you say that that was what you saw when you, as you were writing?
That's an interesting view. I've not heard that before, Nadia. I don't think that she would so much as mellow down. You know, there's a reference to where she has the scar on her cheek, and there are various references to where she, you know, there was a poster of her stuck up somewhere, and you get the impression that she was probably locked up at some point, that there was something that happened. You know, so I don't think it's so much as mellow down. I always thought of her as kind of being in tune with, or perhaps in tune is the wrong word, but more accepting, I think, you know, not of how things are, but I think having learned things about herself, because I think at the beginning she's very restless as well, you know, which I think is something that maybe comes with youth, you know, having that restlessness, because perhaps you don't fully understand the world, you don't fully understand yourself. And I think later on in life, you find some kind of internal peace, I think, you know, which I think maybe even comes from wisdom, you know, and you know, Nadia, you look like a very wise woman, so maybe you're the one who should tell me, you know, does wisdom come with age? I hope so.
Ooh. It's a bit loaded. Oh, maybe we should move on to Coney. Coney?
Well, I didn't actually have any other specific questions, but I mean, on this point, I think, you know, there's a line in the book that I really liked about how it's not the ghosts that are haunted, it's like we are haunted. And I think each character does change as their life, you know, the book kind of takes place from when Bastiaan is born all the way until he dies, really, right? And And I mean, I passed by Nadia the other day and I said, I want to be Rashida. And I, you know, we can have favorite characters because they're not our kids, but you know, I think Rashida, what I really liked about her was I was glad that she didn't, like, she was hard ass in that she could see what was going on. And she's like, I can't be together with you and still do the things I need to do, you know? And like, you could tell she was, okay, I don't want to give, actually, let's not give anything away of what happens because the relationship changes a lot over time. But you can see that she is so politically committed. And I think she seems to me like she comes to peace with certain decisions that she makes at particular points in time. And I mean, I think, again, that also goes back to my favorite thing about the book, which was just how each character, you know, really had such a range of kind of secrets and sorrow and sadness, and their lives changed a lot based on, in part, what they decided to do, and in part the relationships around them. And I really liked I don't know what you call it, but the quote at the very beginning of the book that frames it, which was by Catherine Ann Porter, who says, the past is never where you think you left it. And then the second quote is about hope and the feathers of hope. And I think that kind of somewhere between history and hope are, you know, what is the context that we all kind of grow and change in. And so I just really like that mix of like the politics and then the very personal stories. And there's so many people who I think would like this book. You know, sometimes you read a book and there's you think, oh, I love this, I want to send it on to people, and you realize, nah, actually there's like 6 other people who would actually really like this. But this to me was a book that I'm like, they should make high school students read this in class, or I can imagine, you know, sending it to my mom. I can imagine sending it to my neighbor. And I really hope that more people do read it, because I'd love to have conversations about the book. And, you know, what people made of the various characters and stories in it. And I don't think it's over. I think, like Iman said, that generational tension of who stands up and says what at what time is obviously still ongoing and continuing. So I think it resonates with a lot of the debates about, is apartheid over and is it not over? And if it's not over, who needs to be called out? And I do think that even though the book takes place, you know, many years ago, it really resonates with a lot of the ongoing culture and tradition, but also a lot of the unresolved kind of dynamics of apartheid. So I'm looking forward to hearing what, if there's any other questions from the audience, but also as more people get to read it, what kind of conversations it sparks.
I love that you said that, Connie. Just to comment on that, I think there was really a very excellent takeaway from the book. You know, because I think, and I love history, by the way, and I love that you're so into history. It's so great. You know, and so I think for me personally, and I'd love to hear your views on it as well, you know, it's just, I've always thought that history is on a loop, you know, and it's very much why the book starts and ends the way it does, which I won't go into. But having read the book, it's because, you know, history is on a loop, you know, and I think part of that is because history is really a story about the human condition. You know, it's not about dates and speeches, and it's really about how the things that have defined us as human beings, you know, the quest for power, greed, etc., is something, you know, that we carry with us since the beginning of time. You know, and so I find it incredibly fascinating that you raise those points. I mean, it's the 21st century, you know, and we're still having to make a case for why Black Lives Matter, you know. Inevitably, we come back to the same conversations over and over again. And so I thought that was really insightful of you to mention how pertinent it is to today's issues as well.
Just to quickly also add into this conversation, there's a quote that says, in order to plan for the future, you have to understand your past. And I think that this book is like a perfect example of that as well, is knowing your history, knowing your heritage, When I read, I think I was only maybe chapter 3, and I went to my dad and I was like, oh my word, this book is amazing, and I started talking about it, and then it developed into this conversation of my dad's uncle who passed as white, and then we went into like our family history and all of that, and it opened up this conversation that we had never like really had. Like I knew that this uncle existed and this is in our family heritage, but the personal narratives to it and how it affected our family and my father's relationship to this uncle and how it inspired him. So it also, like, for me personally, it opened up like a passage in my own like family history that like I learned.
That's amazing, Iman. What a great story. I really want to hear more about that offline. It sounds amazing. You know, I think the first thing just on that is, you know, I think sometimes because we're South African and we're so familiar with our history, we actually forget just how unbelievably bizarre, you know, our history was. I mean, the fact that there was a place like the Race Classification Appeal Board, I mean, that as a country, we allowed that to happen at some point in our past is absolutely bizarre. I mean, so that's really something. I mean, and secondly, I think there are so many untold stories in South Africa, you know, just so many things that we don't talk about, you know, and you using this perfect example, you know, where you have the older generation, your parents' generation, you know, telling you a story for the first time that you yourself have never even heard about, you know, and I love that story because I think it's so important because again, you know, these are the things that we carry with us, that we all carry with us, the different things in our suitcase that we never really get to unpack, you know, and here you are, a perfect example of that conversation. And I really hope that it sparks those kinds of things in people's homes. So thanks for sharing that story.
A'Eysha, I think that I'd like to just open up the floor to some questions. I have a question here from Irfan Suleiman, and he says, how do you cater as far as language, vocabulary is concerned for different levels of understandings, please?
That's a very difficult question. Yeah, wow, shukran. I'm going to need about 10 minutes just to get my dictionary. Look, I think the only way I can answer that is to say that, you know, every writer has their own writing style, right? And that is unique to you. It is what is known as your writer's voice. Okay. So, you know, and so I write from, you know, I write from a place that is authentic, you know, or that is a place that is me. Writing a book that everybody understands, I think is impossible, quite honestly. I don't think any writer can write a book that everybody understands, you know, especially because, as I mentioned earlier on, everybody takes something different, you know, away from the book. So the only thing that I as the writer can do, quite honestly, is to write a book that is as real to me, you know, as it can be. You know, and so that's really the only way I can answer that question, you know, unless you'd like to be more specific about specific vocabulary. I know that some people sometimes talk about the use of the K word in this book, for example. Which was something that, you know, was a bit of a debate between myself and my publisher, for example, you know, and we debated like, oh, do you want to say the K word? Should you say the K word, you know, etc. You know, but at the same time, I don't like to shy away from things, you know, especially when it comes to our history. And I don't think we should shy away from those things. You know, we shouldn't try and sugarcoat over the ugliness of our past as well, you know, because that is as worthy of talking about as you know, the success of our democracy, you know, because I think as South Africans, we like to talk about the big things, you know, oh, look, the democracy, this rainbow nation, etc. You know, but at the same time, there's a lot of other things, you know, that were terrible that we never talk about.
Thank you, A'Eysha. I just would like to read some of the comments that have come through. Wasila Latu Everson has said she loves the way you blend so easily the spirituality of Christianity and Islam.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much for that.
And then Keho Makoro says, sameness in diversity, she loves it. We are the human race.
Right.
So true. Yes. So I would just like to open up the floor to questions. Anybody has questions, comments that you'd like to pose to A'Eysha? Most welcome now. How would you like to read the book? We encourage you to read the book. It's absolutely a joy to read. You'll laugh and you'll cry and you'll be sad and you'll reflect on your own life and you'll think about your parents and grandparents. And as Cape Townians, there's so much we can relate to and relate about the book.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the Cape Townian aspect, Nadia, because Cape Town, as I mentioned earlier on, is a big character in the book itself. The setting, a lot of people say, oh, sometimes they don't like to read books about Cape Town because it's so familiar to them, it doesn't feel like an escapism, because a lot of people obviously read to escape. But the thing about our city is that it's just so complicated, and I myself have such a complicated relationship with the city as well. And so all of that is woven into the book. And as Connie mentioned, there are various landmarks that you might be able to pick up on, like the company's gardens is mentioned in the book. And as well as you mentioned the Gatesville Mosque, the Minaret, little throwaway things, that that if you're Cape Townian, you will automatically be able to see in your mind.
I have a follow-on question from Irfan. He said,
Irfan.
As a follow-up question, when one provides commentaries, but one finds to have to write different versions for the different understandings. Let me just read this again. As a follow-up question, when one provides commentaries, but one finds to have to write different versions for the different understandings.
Sorry, is that the question? Because
that's a comment he's put in.
Oh, a comment. Okay.
Yes. I have a quick question.
Why
did you choose the grapefruit? I thought it's not a very delicious fruit.
Yeah, I know. That's exactly why I chose it, because I absolutely detest grapefruits. I absolutely detest them. I have no idea why anyone would eat it. Like, seriously. But look, I mean, I had to choose something that was really unusual. I mean, because there needed to be something extraordinary about that relationship between Khadija and Sanri, and I wanted to choose something that wouldn't just automatically unite anyone, like grapefruit. I wasn't going to choose something like, oh, let them enjoy strawberries. Everybody likes strawberries. Like, who doesn't like strawberries, right? So I really had to choose something that I personally actually just really don't like. So grapefruits were in it. So
the grapes from the vineyard.
Maybe next time I should think about the grapes from the vineyard. Yeah.
So here's another, just a comment from Najma Mohammed. Assalamu alaikum, A'Eysha. Congratulations on getting your book successfully published. You are an inspiration to all young, previously disadvantaged South Africans who never thought it possible to write a book and get it published too. Well done.
Oh, Shukran, that's so kind. That's really so kind, Najma. Shukran for that. It's something I spoke about early on as well, about representation and just how important that is. So I've been reading books my whole life, since I was a child, and my mother says even before I was born. So, but honestly, I grew up looking for somebody who looks like me, okay, in the literature space, and because I grew up in the 80s, I never ever saw anyone who looked like me, and so now, that I've become the person I needed as a child, quite honestly. And I think it's so important that, after waiting to see somebody become this person, sometimes you just have to become the person you needed. So and so that's really all I can say for young people. Sometimes you have to stop waiting, be the person you need.
Here's another comment from Irfan. He says, there's a danger in our intergenerational conflicts where the level of our struggle is not really appreciated. So one comment from a young scholar, Tat, is that it is not befitting for Muslims to partake in demonstrations.
An interesting comment. I'm not quite sure I have feedback on that, but it's an interesting comment, which I will think about.
Any last comments, questions, Iman, Koni, and audience?
I have one last question. So we spoke a lot about how amazing you are, first of all, for breaking this glass ceiling in South Africa, or in our community, shall I say. And so I just wanted to ask, who are there any local authors that inspire you or have inspired you?
Yeah, many.
Yeah.
No, many. I mean, I'll be sitting here all afternoon if I was going to talk to you about books. So, I mean, I don't know if you have another like 2 hours here, Nadia, but no. So I love local writers, and I really wish that local writers got a lot more airtime, quite honestly, because really we are world class, and we shouldn't think that, because somebody is a writer from, Mitchell's Plain or, from Salt River or wherever, that somehow diminishes, the work or the talent that they have, so I think that's really, really, really important. And I think more important than anything is that we tell our own stories, because I think that is something that is so sorely needed. Don't wait for somebody else to tell your story. Own your story, whatever it is, own it and tell it.
Yeah. So a few comments coming up and questions. Mariam Omar says, sometimes you have to become the person you needed. Powerful words. And Najma, and then Muhammad Saleh. What inspired your book cover?
That's interesting. So there's a very boring answer to that, I'm afraid, which is basically that authors don't get to choose their covers. So this was very much a conversation that I had with my publisher. I have a really good relationship with my editor, and so we sat down. We had just a conversation about various options for the cover. And so this is the oak tree that is in the story, and various things happen underneath this oak tree. As you'll see, there's a couple over here, which is Bastian and Rashida. And so we tried to think of a central image that could cement the book. And this was kind of the one we thought up. The rest was really up to the designer. The birds, of course, are, as I mentioned earlier on, a key part of the book. And so it really was that sort of back and forth collaboration of how a book comes to be. But I will tell you a little secret, which nobody knows, and I've never mentioned it before up until now, is that if you look really closely, and I'm not going to say where they all are, but if you look really closely into the tree, you'll see there are little shapes and symbols in the actual branches. I'll point out one over here, just one. You'll see it's a skull. It's a little shape of a skull, which of course Bastian Bierenkamp is the narrator. He's dead, so he's telling the story from the grave. And so there are these little symbols that you'll find in the branches as well, which nobody knows. So now you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. I wouldn't have looked closer. Okay, Irfan finally says, salute A'Eysha. We have to believe we're in world class. Well said. We need to hear more of those from people like you for inspirations. That is wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Irfan. Beautifully said. Thank you.
Someone's raising their hand, I think.
Yes, that's Merle Hodges. Oh, Merle. Merle.
I'm so sorry that I got the invitation for the launch of the book so late. I haven't read the book, but from the comments of the book and from knowing Nadia, I know it's a good book. And I think I just need to compliment you from going to the verbal to actually writing down your thoughts. My question to you is, I mean, I've written science textbooks. And when I saw my first book in published, in the object, I jumped and I screamed and I was like a child. I just want to know, how did you feel when you saw your book published?
Oh man, geez, it was like nothing else, to be quite honest. My family threw me a surprise book party, which I didn't know about. And we had a cake that was a replica of the book, which was something incredibly, incredibly special. And I probably cried, I think, I don't know, maybe I'm still crying on the inside. I don't know. But it's an incredibly special thing. So yeah, for sure.
I think we need to know that story, because I think by publishing a book, people think that you're almost superhuman. And that brings
Not easy.
out your humanity,
It's really not easy, which is why I talk about the failure so much, so that people understand, that it really doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah. So
thank
thank
you.
you so much, Merle. Lovely to see you, Merle. Thank you. Wasila says she loved the characters, including Mrs. Brown, who comes into her own. Yes, I also love Mrs. Brown.
Oh, yes. That's good. I'm glad.
Well, thank you. It is 2 minutes past 4, and we did say an hour. Thank you so much, A'Eysha, for taking time and sharing, your book with us. And I'd also like to thank people at the back, who, like Ludfi Umar, putting it together, always doing it quietly and so professionally, and helping us along, us that are not too techno-savvy. Thank you so much, Ludfi. Thank you very much, Wasila, for putting it all together and getting the panelists and getting us all to do this. Thank you so much, and having conversations with A'Eysha and putting us all together. Thank you so much. And to Salt River Heritage Society for hosting this beautiful book and showcasing wonderful, strong women. And we were very insistent that we did want to do it in Women's Month. And we did want it to be a woman mostly event. And that Ludfi's a feminist, yes. So,
honorary woman.
yes. So thank you so much to the audience for tuning in and listening and joining us this afternoon. And thank you to everybody. And enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.